You're listening to Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless.
Welcome to today's edition of Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless. Peter, welcome back to the microphone.
It's good to be back here.
Peter, we're going to take a little bit of a tangent today. We've been digging deep on some theological issues, and some of these issues, and some we haven't sort of touched on yet in the conversations, are sometimes, I guess you could call contentious or contested. Different people have different opinions of them. Even within the body of Christ, there are topics that we don't necessarily take the same position on. And I mean, that can be some of the hot current topics of, take recently we had the referendum on the yes referendum, gender ideology, how do we deal with refugees, Indigenous people and how we work with them, or how we best undo some of the hurts of the past. So there's a lot of these conversations. I guess others that spring to mind: abortion, euthanasia, all those kind of things. Now, how do we have conversations on those things and keep it civil? We're very much in a world that thinks of the whole cancel culture, and if you disagree with me, you hate me. And so people get shut down, and it's like there's not even room for discussion or debate. Now, we're going to not always see eye to eye with everyone that we love, even within our own families, within our own church communities, and certainly in the broader community. How do we approach those conversations so that we're not creating antagonism and enemies, but are actually really seeking to understand each other's point of views and have meaningful and fruitful conversations? Big question.
Talk about a big question, man. That's a whole library full of questions. It's
sure.
Massive. I think a good starting point is something over the years I've come to call the 5 Ds of a relationship. And it's a way of understanding where we go from unhealthy, unproductive relationships to the kind of relationship that really works. And the 5 Ds work this way. Let's start with the bad ones and we'll work through to the good one. The first D is we'll call disdain. I think that's the worst kind of relationship. You could also use the D of dismiss. Disdain, dismiss, disregard. That's the if you like, that's the bottom of the pit. Kind of today we see it expressed in a lot of cancel culture, and you'll particularly see it in the fact that let's say newspapers that are committed to one ideological spread or another, you'll find that their opponents, and might be a very large proportion of the population, but their opponents' views are simply not discussed. They're just simply, it's as if they don't exist.
Yeah, it's as if there is no other view.
As if there is no other view. And where I see disdain in operation, there's another D that comes in, I get disappointed. Because disdain, disregard doesn't work, because on both sides of nearly every fence I have ever seen problems emerge across, there have been people of immense and intense goodwill. And I believe that we've got to be able to reach across all the fences, look past the issues, even if the positions the people have taken are to us offensive, and we just don't want to engage with them, and we want to disdain it, disregard it, and we don't want it to be there. But the fact it is there, and there are people in there who have, in our view, perhaps dysfunctional, there's another D, dysfunctional, but nevertheless there is a passionate goodwill. And they see our goodwill, what we're doing is also dysfunctional, and therefore they have to oppose and cancel us. So the first thing we've got to do is to work out, we can't be disdaining and disregarding. We have to work out how to engage. Right, now here's the challenge. Because if we just simply say, right, well, okay, I'm going to engage with you, but I'm so offended with what you're going to say, I'll enter into the next D, which is an improvement, but it's not a safe improvement because it's called dispute. And the reason dispute is not a good level is because it can result in people being dead. There's another D.
It's a conflicting kind of level.
Conflict. It's a place of conflict, but at least the conflict is acknowledged. Now, there may be times when, for example, somebody from one ideological position is trying to impose their point of view upon another. And sometimes we have to defend in that place of dispute. I didn't realise there were so many Ds.
It's a popular letter.
We have to defend. And so basically in the issue of dispute, you've got at least the parties are acknowledging each other, but you've got offence and defence.
And it's often done at a very high emotional level.
At a very high emotional level. Wars are fought over those sorts of things. And so at least, though, the issues are being addressed. Now, that's good. So I could even, as I'm thinking about this, I could argue which would be the better, disdain or dispute. But nevertheless, both of them are...
They're both counterproductive.
Both counterproductive. They're not good. The next level of conversation or connection is what we'll call debate. Now, in debate, we are often expressing disputes, but in a way that at least is committed to not doing harm to the opponent, right? We may wish them harm, but we're not going to do harm to them.
It's at a more civil level.
At a more civil level, although if you listen to some of the debates in Parliament, the boundaries of civility are greatly stretched.
That's for sure.
But debate is essentially what you would call an exchange of monologues. Debate is a conversation where one side is trying to defeat the other. There's another D, to defeat the other. So we're trying to defeat the other person's argument, and we're not listening to them to understand them or connect with their heart. We're listening to them to say, where can I find fault in what they're saying? And sometimes we will even try to disfigure or distort what they're saying in order to be able to fraudulently beat their argument. So the purpose of debate is basically an exchange of monologues with the goal of defeating the other person's argument.
That's the whole structure of a debate. That's what it's meant to do, isn't it? It's you present your case, I present my case. Someone at the end of the day wins.
Yes, it's a winner-takes-all competition.
We see similar things in the court of law.
Yes.
It's that kind of a, I'm not sure what you call it, but adversarial.
Adversarial, I think that's
approach.
A good word.
Yeah.
Yes. So the point is, at least we've gone now where we're not disdaining each other. We're not in the kind of hostile dispute that is just plain straight out conflictual, but we are still in a place of, if you like, there's still an element of dispute there, but at this point we are debating and engaging. And at the better end of debate, there is some respect for the other parties, and we're listening to them. But the goal is to have my point of view prevail and their point of view be defeated.
And there's, at least, though, there's acknowledgement that someone has a different opinion.
Yes, there is acknowledgement of that.
Yeah.
There may be absolute dislike of it.
And disagreement with it.
Right, disgust. Yeah, we've got a lot of Ds today. Right, but that can be there. But then the next level is what we'll call discussion. Now, in discussion, it may be, let's say, for example, in a debate, the two parties listen to something. Oh, dude, that's a good idea. I haven't heard of that before. That's an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure how to debate that. Let's sit down and discuss that. Now, the way I've had the word discuss described to me, its etymology has something to do with cutting up something as if with scissors. So we cut the article together. So two people sit down. They might still be adversaries, but they are now discussing this thing, trying to work out something together. Well, that's actually quite an improvement, because at this point they're trying to understand and to develop a mutual understanding, but they are still not really interested in each other, but it is one step better than trying to defeat the other person's argument.
They've moved to the place of saying, okay, I acknowledge you have a different view, and I want to understand why.
Yes.
They're at least sort of, I'm not necessarily going to say I'm going to agree with you or switch to your view, but I want to know how did you get to that place?
Yes, and I might even be doing that to work out just exactly what you're thinking, so that then I can get back to debate and defeat you.
Possibly.
Right, so there's all these sorts of undercurrents can be happening. But then sometimes in these processes of discussion and connection with each other, we start to discover there's another person, and we start to develop some kind of affection, bond, respect. Right? They may become a friend or an anti-friend, but there is some kind of connection that starts to occur. And the degree to which that kind of connection starts to occur, we're starting to communicate heart to heart. Or as Martin Buber, famous theologian in the early part of the 20th century, said, it's becoming an I and a thou relationship where I'm connecting with another person. And that's what we're entering into. That's what's called dialogue. Now, people often confuse debate with dialogue. Dialogue is where there is a genuine, deep respect and, if dare I say, a warm-hearted embrace of the other person, even if they never become what you'd call, quote-unquote, a friend. There is a deep, respectful, personal embrace of that other person. And interestingly enough, that fits into the category of what in the Bible is called the agape love, right? Warm-hearted commitment to their well-being, even though we may disagree with them. But we're now in a place of genuine communication and dialogue. And I feel that coming to the culture that we've worked in, I think we've been going backwards in this as a culture.
I agree.
People are discussion, even healthy discussion, even healthy impersonal discussion is becoming more and more rare. Debate where the parties respect each other is becoming rarer. And so what we're really in places of, if you like, the lower levels of dispute. And we even saw, for example, in the recent election in the United States, attempts at assassination and these sorts of things. And then we take a look at the kind of dispute that we're seeing in Israel and the kind of dispute that we're seeing in Ukraine. These are serious matters.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at that progression, as you've gone through there with the 5 Ds, what you move from is, at the bottom end, as you said, the whole disdain, cancel sort of culture is, all I'm seeing is an opposing idea. Whereas when you get to dialogue, what you've got is a differing view with a person. It's become a person thing, not an idea thing. So we've moved from the abstract, the concept of you disagree with me on this issue and you're a representative of that disagreeing issue or that viewpoint, through to where what you've called dialogue is, I'm sitting down with a person and I'm actually talking through where we have differences and even possibly being open to finding that, well, you actually have merit in your view. So it's moving from concept to person.
Yes. Yes, it's actually learning the person that you're with. Every other human being is a whole world of discovery. And as we learn each other, we treat each other as something to be learned and understood. And I've got to acknowledge my ignorance of you. I don't know where you're at, right? And the thing is, until I understand your understanding of goodness, truth and beauty, and I engage with your understanding of goodness, your understanding of truth, your understanding of beauty, and when we connect those things together in each other, then we work out, right, so I can see now, given your life history, the things that have influenced you, the traumas you've had, the disappointments you've had, the successes you've had, the way you've come to understand yourself, how your personality's made, I can see, right, if I travel all through those avenues and pathways and the whole map of your life, I can say, right, I can see why and how you get to there, and there. Now, when I think of those things, I can't quite see how those work. Let's talk about that. Let's engage and let's grow together.
Yeah.
And then we're not even looking at disagreements. We're exploring life and reality and truth together.
I mean, I believe the whole area of electronic communication, if you want to call it in really broad terms, be it emails, be it social medias, be it, have made this descent into dismissal, descent into disdain easier, because it's so much easier to say something on a keyboard than it would be to maybe say that to them face to face.
Yes.
But I think it's always been an issue because, I mean, even if you go back to last century, I mean, the letters to the editor in the local papers, people would say things in those letters to the editor they'd never say face to face. Again, it's like you get that one step removed where it's no longer a person you're addressing an ideology or a party or a viewpoint. But you wouldn't say that face to face.
Yes, and you end up in hostile polarisation. And all of a sudden you're not opposing people, you're opposing an idea, and the person has become dehumanised. They become the representative of something that has to be cancelled or destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess taking the recent American election, it's not sort of people, it's you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, and it's that party, that standing, that perception of that whole group that was being fought over a lot of it rather than policies or people.
And if you take a look at the kind of language that we see used these days, people, let's say some people will scorn those who are woke, right? And then they will scorn those who are fundamentalists. And I must admit, there are times I go into meetings with people who would be, let's say, very much on the left-wing culture, who would be very on that whole dimension of the gender wars. And when I'm sitting around those tables, sometimes I'll say to them, you know, until you can say the word fundamentalist without being insulting, without meaning it as an insult, you're not true to label.
Yeah.
But I'll say the same thing when I'm sitting amongst people, and I've got a number of friends who would be, if you like, on what today would be almost considered to be the extreme right wing. But what I see in them is people whose desire is for goodness. And I'll say to them, until you can say the word woke without meaning it as an insult or something to oppose, or progressive, until you can say those things with genuine love, you're not actually loving your enemies. You're not true to your own labels. So you can't claim to be Christian and live in that polarity. That's the issue.
When we get into these conversations, which we inevitably will on some of these, call them hot topics, whatever, contentious issues, it's so important to remember the person in the room.
Yes.
Whether they're in the room or whether they're on the end of a Facebook post, that's a person.
Yes.
That's a person, as you've talked about, they've had a journey. Something has brought them to where they have the belief they have. And they've got good reason within themselves for having that view. And we don't get that. We don't see that. We don't understand that. We don't comprehend that. We just arc up at the thought instead of saying, well, okay, Fred, Mary, whoever, I don't know how you got to where you're at, but let's seek to understand that.
Yes. And I think in that we've got to be careful of, in addressing things like that, to be gentle in the way we speak to folk, because I'm often surprised when people speak to me. All of a sudden something happens and I'll start to arc up and I think, oh, goodness me, what's happening in me, right? And when I speak to other people, often I'll see them arc up. And so I've learned in conversation, and I'm continually learning in conversation, to do my best to keep things cool, to keep things calm. Watch the temperature of the conversation. The temperature of the conversation is more important often than the conversation itself, because the moment you're so desperate, I've got to get this point across, I can almost guarantee you won't get the point across because the other person won't hear you. All they'll do is feel your pressure.
So instead of perhaps reacting, saying, I'm wrong, I disagree, it's more, that's an interesting viewpoint. How did you get to that? How did you arrive at that?
Yes, and to learn how to seek understanding and to help a person say things. And one of the things I've realised in doing that is in listening, which itself is a major skill. It's not an easy thing to learn, but it's a very important skill to learn. But in listening, I've learned more and more to listen until I'm finding the person repeating themselves. And when a person starts to repeat themselves, and I do the same thing when I'm talking, I will start to repeat myself. And that says, right, okay, that means I have articulated the fullness of what I understand and I'm going over it again.
Yeah.
And then the moment a person is starting to repeat themselves, the next step in listening is to be able to feed back to that person what you've heard them say until they can recognise their thoughts in your words. And the moment you have reached that point, you're then at the point to be able to say, but I'm not sure about this or about that, or I think differently about this and about that. And I'll even try to avoid hot words like disagree, because that contains the nuance of opposition. But it's constantly seeking to understand, and you can really only ever get to express your point of view when the other person has invited you to do so.
Yeah, because you can't really disagree with someone if you don't know what they're saying.
Precisely.
You've got to let them and give them room to unpack it all, and then you can go, okay, I see where you got that. Now, I would possibly interpret what you've gone through differently, and this is a conclusion I would have come to from that.
Yes.
So you're now discussing civilly differing views, but trying to seek understanding as to why those views are held.
Yes. And it's understanding that in those conversations, particularly when we arc up, there's always lots we want to say. The hardest thing I've had to accept is that if we're arced up, there's no point trying to say all the lots I've just realised I've got to say, because it's not going to be heard. The other person's only going to feel pressure, not want to understand. And we're going to be slipping up the scales into debate and dispute rather than staying in the place of dialogue. And that's like the old horse's glue analogy I gave you. In many of these situations, I'll say to folk, look, it's more important to be gracious than it is to be right. The heat of the conversation is often more important than the content of the conversation.
Yeah, it's can you walk away from this conversation and have kept the relationship intact?
Precisely. Otherwise, you're not going to come back and develop understanding together. And this is the issue of dialogue. And I'm sure the listeners will be wondering why on earth I mentioned horse's glue. But I can remember many years ago when I first went to high school and I did my first, I think it was manual arts class, I think it was called in those days, and we were learning how to glue bits of wood together. And the teacher taught us how to use horse glue. And of course, you don't use that these days. But horse's glue was made out of horses' hooves. And it was dark brown, sticky, smelly stuff. And you had this pot of it, and you had to heat it up so it melted. Mm-hmm. And you would paint it on the two bits of wood you were going to join together and stick them on. And as it cooled, it was a very strong glue. It had bound. It really held things together. The only problem with that glue was if that piece of furniture got heated, it fell apart.
The glue would soften again.
And I always liked that. I always think that's like human relationships. The goodwill that we express, the graciousness we use between each other is like horse's glue. If you heat it, it melts. So the heat of the conversation is the measure to which you're actually going to be able to get any real understanding and dialogue. And we really do need to learn those skills desperately in our society today.
Peter, I think we'll have to wrap that up there, but I think the final thought would be, remember that when you're having discussions with people like this, they are people. They have feelings, they have their thoughts, they have their journeys they've walked on. Seek more to understand than to win.
Yes.
Thanks, Peter.
Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless is a production of rema.cc.